Shakank. Well, hello. Well, hello there. I've always wanted to swivel in my chair. Oh, I'm going to do it again. So, you've made it this far. Hello. What up?
When escaping.
Yo, that's from my favorite. Let's say Captain America: Avengers. I love it. The English translations is so poor. There's a part where Captain America goes, "Why should it goes this well? Where is the laser?" And then Whirlwind says, "You'll be the one escaping." Call the police. All right, you guys. Hello. Welcome back to Pencil to Pencil, your favorite pandemic podcast. Live stream, in your face stream. We're back, y'all. And I'm back too. Well, hello. Welcome back to All and Sundry. I'm so glad to be back. My name is JAMAR NICHOLAS. I'm a cartoonist, author, illustrator, the author of Leon the Extraordinary, a series at Scholastic on the graphics imprint. I am one of your co-hosts tonight. I am joined at the proverbial hip by two people. That's a lot of hipping, right? You guys missed this, right? You ready for it? I'm going to introduce the world heavyweight champion of webcomics, Stone Cold Steve Conley. Well, hello, Steve Conley. How are you, sir?
Hello, Jamar. So good to have you back. You have been missed.
It's great to see you, Steve. Steve, what do you do?
I write and draw the webcomic The Middle Age. And when I'm not working on The Middle Age, I also create TTRPG content, things for role-playing games. The latest was Intoximancy.
Yeah.
And, while you were away, Jamar, I ran a whole Kickstarter while you were gone.
What I miss? That's fantastic. And how did it? Was this your best one?
No, but it was the best one in the gaming space. Each one's getting a little bit better. It's fun. It's a lot of fun. It's a whole other world. I'm enjoying it as a big part of my nerd origin story is tied to role-playing games, and so it's fun to scratch that itch.
That's fantastic. It's great to see you, Steve. And you're ready for this part. I would be remiss if I did not introduce the full bird kernel of comic book illustration, the maestro of mark making. I got that from you, Steve. Nice. Mike Manley. Hello, Mike Manley. How are you, sir?
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the hour or the 90 minutes
yes.
of pure comic insider excitement.
That's right. It's a rich ore of comic content.
Oreo of comics.
I like how sedate you said all of that, Mike.
You know what? It's funny, you guys. My energy is really high because I miss you guys. I've been off on assignment. And can everybody in the chat who's watching live, please give a round of applause and a sip of coffee for these two guys. They held it down. And you guys did amazing content over the last couple of weeks. I even said off camera, I was like, yo, should I even come back? Y'all don't need me.
How dare you? How dare you?
You guys were fantastic.
You just wanted us to hear us say, but no, we love you.
Any good parts of the show while Jamar was away was because he was texting us instructions.
I did
to Bergeracking the whole thing.
I did a small amount of producing, just a tiny bit. But
now, turn to them and tell them we love them.
But I'm glad that the show must go on, and I think that's one of the coolest parts about what we're doing, because as they used to say in church, well, monkey don't stop no show. So I'm glad that we.
What church was that? Church of Martin Bailey.
I went to church in Philly, so things like that.
Okay.
So I'm glad that things still go on, so we can keep moving if one of us is down. So thank you guys so much. Look at that, you guys! Such great content in the chat. What up, Matt? Matt says the guys made you proud. Thank you. D. Brad gives claps. The good ones. What up, Wilversado? We have to have you on soon. Thank you guys so much. And also, you guys, Please don't let me take over because I'm whirlwinding.
That's great.
We are coming back to you at full force with a guest tonight. And, we haven't had a guest in a while. And one of the coolest things that I think happened over the past month and change is that we kind of revitalized the boot camp kind of part of the podcast into something a lot more richer. I don't know if you guys agree with that.
I think so. Yeah, I love it. It was a chance to play around with the format a little bit. It was like, I was fun, but no, we were missing this two-legged table cannot stand.
And I think what's also cool about that is the things that you guys were doing while I was away, kind of like we're doing more deep dives into subjects rather than just a blanket boot camp episode where people log on and they're like, I don't know what's going to happen tonight. Like you guys started doing really great vertical slices of subjects like framing the shot or drawing hair or, composition. And I think
don't know. That was hard, that one, drawing hair.
And and for a couple of those, Mike, I swore the viewers want part twos. Like we could have done a part two to each one of these things.
For sure.
So I'll bring it back to the viewers. If you want to see more content like we're doing, if you want to see like another round of something, please tell us. So we can kind of figure out what we're going to do next. But I love all the energy. And to that point, one thing that the mob has asked for is like a different facet of the comic illustration and comic book industry. Is like, why don't you have some writers on? Why don't you have editorial on? What's an agent do? Like all of those kind of things that we're really taking into consideration. And we're going to start tonight, you guys, because we have a fantastic beginning for, I don't know, we don't have a title for it, but we'll figure it out on the fly. An old friend and also a legend in the industry, Joseph P. Illidge, is joining us tonight. Iconic, there's no pun there, Joe's rolling his eyes behind it. Iconic editor, writer, person in the mix, is joining us, is in the green room waiting to get the spotlight on him. And we have a lot to talk about. This is really fantastic. So for everybody that's watching live, please, this is the time for, besides just listening with your eyeballs, give us some questions to ask Joe, because, how many times do you get chances like this to talk to somebody who's been so entrenched in the history of comics to join us tonight, right? All right, so let's bring him on. Hold on, I got to get the cake ready. Hold on, Joe, you're about to come on. Let's bring him in. Joe Illidge. Woohoo! That was a great render.
Hey there, everyone. Good to see y'all.
Hey, thank you, brother. Thanks for coming on.
I needed that, like, editor's blue pencil.
Listen, I can appreciate that. I'm familiar with that instrument.
I'm gonna start off with some really odd questions, Joe, and then we'll just start the churn.
Sure.
Does I know a lot of things have been changing just in the world of not even editorial, but just how people like process like writing longhand, so to speak. And at one of my old day jobs, one of the old administrative assistants used to write notes in shorthand. Like shorthand, like that's old school. Like you would look at her notes, she left them on the table once, and it was just like zeros with lines going through it, and like dashes and dittos. And she was like, "Oh yeah, I'll turn this. I'll write this up and give it back to you." I'm like, it's like hieroglyphics. So maybe the first thing I'll ask you, and this is just like a straight like bum editorial question, is
Sure.
Where in editorial school do they teach you all the editor kind of like shorthand notes like stet and TK and all of those type of things? When did you learn all that stuff?
That's funny. I learned a lot of that from my first editorial job, which was at Milestone. And I started at Milestone in the company's first year of publication, 1993. So this is Milestone's 30th anniversary, and it's a 30th anniversary in my career in publishing. And so it was under the wing of Dwayne McDuffie, God rest his soul, that I first saw the editing process firsthand. And when I would see those things, I asked the questions: what does TK mean? What does stet mean? All those things. And what does FPO mean? For position only, all these things. So that's when I first learned it, and it was seeing it in action. So I would be alongside Dwayne and sometimes alongside Matt Wayne, who was an editor there as well, and watch them go through art pages, talk with them about scripts. And so that's how I really learned about it firsthand. When I moved over to DC Comics and started working in the Batman editorial department, that's when things went into hyperdrive. Right? Because the nature of being one of the caretakers of Gotham is so vast. And when I stepped in there in 1998, I stepped into this 1-year-long project called Batman No Man's Land. So it was Batman on acid, right? And so I really learned by observing other people, asking questions. Asking questions is one of the most important things in starting a new job or being on the road to what will become your vocation.
And you were also at that time, comics was going through a lot of technical changes because the computer coloring was coming in, the computer lettering was coming in, all that stuff, right? Like in the beginning of when I was on Batman, they were still in '94. They were still lettering on board. Ken Bruzenak was still lettering it on the board, and then within like a year or two, they went to lettering on overlays that were then pasted on to the board.
Right.
Depending upon the office. I don't think I did that for Carlin, Mike Carlin. But you also went through that whole thing where everything was constantly changing, right? Because they were bringing in computer coloring and, desktop publishing, aspects.
100%. So I was there from 98 to 2000, and the production team dealt with the overlays and then putting the balloons on the artwork. So editorial and production worked very closely together. And at the time, DC Superhero editorial was on floor 6, Vertigo was on floor 7, and I believe production was on the 5th floor. So there were a lot of trips up and down the elevator and up and down the stairs as books were crashing, as books would have to come back for review, because we also had a proofreader on staff. Her name was Arlene Lowe. And so we would work with her as well. Insofar as coloring went through a major shift because it was in 1999 that DC purchased Wildstorm Studios from Jim Lee.
Right.
And it's public knowledge that one of the reasons they purchased Wildstorm was because the Wildstorm coloring studio was the hottest, most innovative team of colorists in the industry at that time. And so being able to bring the Wildstorm studio coloring team onto DC Comics really then shot us to a whole new level. And when we revamped the entire Batman line of books for the year 2000, what turned out to be the tip of the spear title was Batman Detective Comics, which was written by Greg Rucka and was illustrated by Sean Martinborough. And Mark Chiarello, who at the time was the art director, had this idea that he wanted Detective Comics to look like European graphic novels. He was highly inspired by Torpedo.
Right.
And so we wanted Detective Comics to have the one color aesthetic. So you would have black and white, and then you would have one color, and each issue would have a different color. It would be red, it would be yellow, it would be green. And it was the Wildstorm team that helped realize that. So that kind of change in the coloring technology and the acquisition of Wildstorm was crucial to DC's evolution into the next millennium.
Right. And then you went from that old world where you would color it on Xeroxes and put the code down, and all the old world color. That was a big shift.
It was a big shift, and to be perfectly candid, it was a shift that created tension, because then you had a pool of colorists that started to shrink, and understandably they were not happy about that kind of transition. So it was a historic time in comics, and there were some creators that still maintained the way they did their process. One of those, who I consider one of the best comic book colorists of the last 30 years, I don't know where she is, but she was truly a saint. Her name was Gloria Vasquez. And she was the colorist I worked with on Birds of Prey. And Gloria was a sweetheart, and she was one of the most amazing colorists because she was artistically literate. She understood light, shadow, temperature, and so she did things that most colorists at the time were not doing. And so even without using the computer technology, she was still a Top Gun colorist.
Right. I mean, if you understand color, it doesn't matter whether you're using a computer or you're doing by hand, you're coding. If you don't understand color, you'll still just make bad color on a computer.
Well, the fact of the matter is, to your point, if you have the analog skills, then the technology is an asset to you. If you don't have the analog skills, then the technology could actually reveal your absence of analog skills.
Yeah. It was definitely I think that last probably between 94, 95 and 2000, that was a big change for a lot of people in comics, in the beginning of basically you having to have technology to do your job, as opposed to what it was previously. You just needed a sheet of paper, pencil, pen and ink, typewriter, whatever. But then you had to have, you got to have Photoshop, you got to have internet, you got to have all these other things that you didn't have to have before.
100%. And the thing is that it happened so quickly that I do not feel the artistic community en masse had the time to adopt the new technology and adjust, right? And that is unfair. The unfortunate reality is the industry was responding to the audience, and the industry was responding to Image Comics. Image Comics looked so bonkers and different that the people who were consuming them were looking at other comic books and considered them dated. And so the other publishers reacted to the response to Image Comics. And whether or not historically that was the right decision is up for a longer discussion. But definitely, you talk about 94 to 2000, to Tom Zoller's point, yes, lettering, also very crucial. I specifically remember, and I say this affectionately, I remember the Malibu Ultraverse line of books. And I remember I was so excited for those books to come out. And I bought a lot of those books, Firearm, The Solution, things like that. And I remember I would get the books and the lettering stuck out to me. It just wasn't at the level of lettering that I was used to from other publishers. And that's what happens, right? Every piece of the puzzle makes the whole greater. When one of the pieces doesn't hold up, you can tell. The same way when one of the pieces is extraordinary, it can make up for other things. You mentioned Ken Bruzenak. when you're talking about the seminal work of Howard Chaykin, you can't talk about that without talking about Ken Bruzenak. You can't talk about the Sandman from Vertigo without talking about Todd Klein. You can't really talk about 90s Batman without John Costanza, right? So every element is part of the art that defined these characters, defined these eras, and I think, unfortunately, that is something that is still not yet understood.
Yeah, I mean, for me, one of the biggest differences was that when I would get something that I would draw, and then it would go off to be lettered, and then the lettering would come back, that allowed me seeing, oh, okay, now the balloon's here. It's getting kind of close to that guy's head. I can make an adjustment, right? Where if it's being handled in editorial, I don't see like, oh, maybe I would have moved that balloon over a little bit, or maybe I would have oonched something over a little bit. And there was a lot of stuff like that. Or, like I said, when they were actually gluing the art on the board, then you had another thing, because you had lettering glued on the artboard, and then you had to get close to it, and the ink would run underneath it created another like production issue.
I can sympathize, because I dealt with art so much, and art from so many different artists, that I would see these things happen. And for me, I remember, so there's two artists that I remember when I think about what you're talking about, one of whom is Dan Jurgens, because Dan Jurgens was the first artist that I saw that would put balloon guides on his pencil pages, basically instructing the artist where to put the balloons. So he composed pages with the consideration of leaving enough oxygen for the dialogue. Mm-hmm. The second person that always comes to mind is Bill Sienkiewicz. And I don't think I ever told this story publicly, and I think Bill will forgive me, because it just speaks to how crazy he is as an illustrator and how influential he is. One time he said to me, "Put the balloons down and I'll illustrate around them." I said, "What?" He said, "Put the balloons down wherever you want on the board, and I'm going to do the story around them." Now, I totally folded, because I was not ready for that. But just the fact that he asked me to do that, I was like, oh, that's pretty gutsy. Right? So
the old EC comics use that Leroy lettering. Have you ever seen the Leroy lettering guide? I actually saw somebody, I think it was on Instagram, was doing it. So it was a template, and it had an ink, like a double. So when you slid the guide around, the ink nib actually made the lettering. So a lot of the old EC stuff was lettered before the artists got it.
Wow.
It was already lettered on the board before they got it.
That's wild. That's
wild. So yeah. Because Kurtzman was like a real control freak about stuff.
That does not surprise me, considering his reputation and his influence. It does not surprise me that he was a control freak.
So, all right, I'm gonna put my foot in here real quick, because I'm really afraid of us chewing up all the time, Joe. Because we could talk about anything for 45 minutes and it would be dope.
That's true.
But I don't want to lose you in the soup here. So one thing that we always do on the podcast is we ask our guests to give us their origin story. So what that means to me is, like, if you could tell us a little bit about what you were doing before you became a pro and what kind of guided you into the industry and any other kind of tidbits. I'm a big fan, me personally, of the Jump story. And just kind of to quickly make sense of that is there's always a story with all of us that there was a moment in time where you did something wild to figure out that you were going to do this. Like we have Reggie Byers on a long time ago, and he's talked about like digging through the Comico trash can behind the building, trying to figure out how to get it. Everybody's got a story like that. So
Right.
I would love to just hear how you started.
Oh man, I mean that's interesting. So I'll tell some things that I don't usually tell on interviews.
Okay.
Let's do that.
Okay.
So one of the persons that I usually leave out of my origin story is my dad. God rest his soul. He did not dig superheroes. The comic books that he purchased were Deathlock the Demolisher, Sergeant Rock, Jonah Hex, and Scalp Hunter.
Mm.
And so he was very much into, the cowboy stories, the soldier stories, because when you think about it, Deathlock was a soldier from the future, so it stayed within that genre. And when I was in the 3rd grade, he gave me an art book. It was The Western Art of Frederick Remington. And at that time, I couldn't appreciate it because I wasn't interested in Westerns. I wasn't interested in the aesthetic. I still have that book to this day because now I understand why my dad gave it to me, because he knew I was interested in art and he wanted me to see art. And when you're talking about Frederick Remington, that's what you're talking about. One of the defining artists of that genre, of that portrait of life. So my dad had a little bit of an injection of influence. For me, I would say I went to the High School of Art and Design, and I went to School of Visual Arts, both in New York, back when I had a fantasy that I was going to be a comic book artist. That did not turn out to be, because I have the skills to illustrate from observation, but not from imagination. So it was not my destiny to be a comic book artist like Mr. Manley here. What did happen, though, is that in 1993, I was in between jobs and I went to a newsstand and I saw the regular spinner rack of all the regular comic books. But then I saw an issue of a comic book called Icon by a publisher called Milestone that a friend of mine was interning at and told me about, and I did not pay them attention because they had an internship program, but it was a free internship. But when I saw that Icon comic, that was a defining moment of my life, because I saw that, first off, I had never been validated as a person through comic book fiction. And as a Black geek, I was born in 1969. So I was a comic book kid of the 70s. I was a comic book teen of the 80s. And those were not good times to be that, right? So I was a pariah. I was an outcast. I was a nerd, when that was truly a derogatory term. And that comic book showed me that my interests had a future, a tangible career future, and that there was fiction that showed that I was a part of that future, right? And so when I saw that comic book, I knew that I had to work at that company, no matter what it took, because I knew Milestone was going to change the world.
It was such a good first issue. It was such a good first issue.
Yeah, that wasn't, but the issue that I saw was the second issue. I would get to Milestone and then later on find out about issue 1, which is, of course, a great comic book. And Hardware 1 is one of the best #1 superhero comics ever written, ever produced by a North American publisher. That's not an opinion, that's a fact. So when I started at Milestone as an intern, and I saw the inner workings of a comic book company, from the creative to the business. And when I saw this staff of people from different backgrounds and different cultures, and everyone was enjoying themselves, it was paradise.
Yeah.
I couldn't believe it. Right. And so that was when I knew I had to be in the business. I didn't know that editorial was going to be my future until Dwayne,
Mhm.
until being a recipient of his pearls of wisdom and by his humanity. He brought his humanity to editing, to story. And that's when I knew that that's what I wanted to do. I always loved stories, and to be able to work with creators and be an architect in this process that would create this fiction that would, if we were lucky, stand the test of time. That was it. That was the call.
I love it. That's a
So,
shame.
so you started as an intern, unpaid.
100%. Not only was I unpaid, I was losing money because in 1993, the MetroCard in New York did not allow for a free transfer from a bus to a train or vice versa. And I lived in a two-fare zone. So I was losing money every day I interned at Milestone.
Wow. So hopefully your internship was brief before they
it was 3 months of the most exciting and educational time of my life. And I did things that were fun. I did things that were boring, but I did what I was told, and I always completed the mission.
Mhm. Yeah.
And they
saw how
were
the sausage was made.
Yeah.
exactly. And so they were kind and generous enough to offer me a part-time position. And I started on the business side. I was the assistant to the president, who was Derek T. Dingle. And so I started in business and then transitioned over to editorial later.
Wow. So, can you talk a little bit about, maybe just for the brass tacks, for people who may not know exactly what being an editor uh, conveys, entails? That's the word I was looking for. So, Joe, what was your day to day in editorial at Milestone? Like, what what were you doing every day, and how were you interacting with the creative and all of that? If you could talk about that.
Okay. And I would say Milestone and my time on Batman at DC had similar dynamics, although different scales. So I think in the descriptions, I'll be describing both eras. So there's basically 3 parts to being an editor, and I'm not necessarily saying them in the order of importance.
Sure.
One is that you're a caretaker. You're a caretaker of intellectual properties. Intellectual properties are ideas that have long-term value to an organization. They're copywritten and trademarked, and those ideas come with rules. And as the caretaker, your job is to protect the characters, protect the world, because you are maintaining the integrity of the intellectual property. So when I was at Milestone as an editor, I was the editor of Hardware. At the time, Hardware was their flagship character. Later on, the company's flagship character would become Static because of the Static Shock cartoon. But in terms of Milestone's first iteration of publishing, Hardware was the flagship character. He was the first character that was published by the line. So in editing Hardware, a daily basically process would usually involve editing scripts, going through art at different stages. That would be pencils, that would be inks, that would be colors. It would be having conversations with the production department and going back and forth with them through different processes. It would involve having conversations with Dwayne McDuffie, who was the editor in chief, and Matt Wayne, who was an editor, and also Jacqueline Ching, who was an editor as well, because the editors would go back and forth because the books would intertwine. So we would, of course, want to be in concert with continuity and how characters acted and things of that nature. So that's part one. Part two is you're a traffic manager.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to make sure that the trains are always running on time, because comic books are one aspect of comic books. Speaking to the direct market, it's a periodical business. Every 30 or 31 days, a new issue of whatever your favorite book comes out. And no matter what kind of chaos is happening behind the scenes, the consumer does not care. Every 30 days, the consumer wants the latest issue of Static. And if they don't get it, then they're going to go buy Flash.
Mm-hmm.
And you do not want to be responsible for them not going to buy Flash. You want them to stay on your train. So you have to make sure that all of the participants, the creators, are working on schedule, and that they're maintaining a level of quality, right? There always has to be a quality standard. The third part of the job is to be an ally and an advocate, whether that's you being an ally to the creator and sometimes an advocate for the creator to your company, or whether you're being an advocate of the company sometimes to the creator. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about Batman. So when I was working on Batman, you're dealing with a lot of books every month, and you're dealing with books at three stages: books that are getting wrapped up, books that are in process, and books that are coming. Right. You're dealing with three different stages, three different timelines. And within all of that, you're always going to want to get creators who want to push the envelope because it's creatively exciting. So I'll tell you a situation that happened once in me being a caretaker of Batman. So Batman was a paradox of DC Comics, because there was the Batman that was part of Gotham City. He looked over Gotham City with the whole Bat Squad. And then there was the Batman in the Justice League of America that would go to different planets and different dimensions and go all over the world and have a bat jet and bat missiles and all of that stuff. And at the time, Grant Morrison, who is obviously one of the most seminal writers in comics of the last 35 years, was writing Justice League of America. And there was a scene in which Batman picked up a gun to assault a villain to prevent the villain from killing one of his teammates. Now, if you understand Batman, you understand that guns are anathema to Batman for a very good reason. One of them ripped through the bodies of his mother and father and changed his life forever. So psychologically, Batman is not cool with guns. And I remember as a kid reading a miniseries, I believe Denny O'Neil wrote, called Untold Legend of the Batman. And a criminal pointed a gun at Batman, and Batman almost slapped him to death. He had a rigid hand, and he said, "You pull a gun on me?" And the camera kept going in more, and the coloring became more monochromatic. And that's when I understood guns are anathema to Batman. They are particularly repulsive. And so I went to Denny O'Neil when I saw this page in pencils, because the Justice League editor showed it to me. And I said, "Hey, I don't think this is cool. What do you think?" And so he took it to the Justice League editor at the time. The Justice League editor and Denny, I believe, had a conversation with Grant Morrison. And now, if you find that issue in publication, it was a storyline where the Justice League of America was fighting the Shaggy Man. But in the first part of the storyline, they were fighting the Ultramarines. Now in publication, Batman used explosive batarangs.
Mhm.
He did not use the gun. And from one perspective, you could think, like, kid, are you crazy to contradict a Grant Morrison Justice League of America script? But my answer was, no, I'm not crazy. I'm one of the protectors of Batman.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And Batman should not pick up a gun to shoot anybody or anything. So that's part of the whole thing, right? So sometimes you're looking out for the company. And that was a situation in which I had to look out for the company before the creator. Sometimes it goes in the reverse direction where you may have a creator, the creator deserves a raise, and then you go to your superior and you advocate for that creator getting a raise, right? So it goes in both directions. So I would say those are the three primary aspects: being a caretaker of intellectual property, being a traffic manager, and being a multi-directional advocate.
Mhm. Joe, what are I'm getting some weird echoes here. Sorry about that. I have so many questions, but Steve, do you have anything you want to put on here? Let me work on my audio.
Well, I'm loving every part of this. I'm loving. It's like I don't know. It's like looking back through time, like this with a very specific angle that we didn't have before.
Yeah.
When that time was also a time when the distribution for comics was kind of in tumult. There was the distributors were like Marvel was picking up. Marvel was buying Heroes World and cutting off avenues of distribution. How did that affect what you were doing and the lines you were controlling?
To be honest with you, I was not so connected to that aspect of the business that I was able to perceive what its impact on my day to day was. I can tell you that I do remember when I started at Milestone, the reason I was able to do that is because there were two catalogs. There was Previews, which was a catalog of Diamond, and there was Advance Comics, which I believe was it Heroes World?
Capital City.
Capital
City, yeah.
Capital City. I usually remember that. This time I missed. And so there were two distributors at that time in the early 90s. That would change in a few years, and then you would just have the one distributor, which was Diamond. And of course, that changed the nature of the direct market profoundly for decades. But I was not able to perceive that, you know, working at DC Comics, working on Batman was so immersive, right? That I did not really have the eye for the holistic apparatus of the industry at the time, even though it was certainly impacting what I did in a variety of ways.
Right.
Yeah, I think a lot of people did not really see that aspect until Capital City went out of business, and then numbers were halved immediately overnight. Drastically, numbers fell, and people were like, "Oh, hey, wait a minute!" Because all those comic book stores went out of business because Diamond did not continue the accounts of a lot of the people that were formerly Cap. So
Right.
really, a lot of stuff.
You had stores going out of business. You had independent publishers that no longer had the orders that they had because Capital City as a distributor was another outlet. And when you're talking about the 90s into the early aughts, the 90s led to an explosion of new independent publishers. And it also led to the growth of established publishers. So the 90s is when Dave Sims' Cerebus really seemed to shoot into the stratosphere. The 90s was when we had the birth of Chaos Comics, Valiant Comics, Malibu Comics,
Boom.
Image Comics, right? So the elimination of distributor competition really was, it was a harsh punch in the nose to the independent creators. You know, obviously publishing juggernauts like Marvel and DC would weather the storm, but beyond them, it was all the other publishers that really had to deal with the brunt of what came from losing one distributor.
And talking about the role of editor, has that changed much over the decades, or do you see the role as largely the same, or has the nature of how books are distributed and content's distributed, has that altered that role?
It's changed significantly in a number of ways. So here is at least two ways that it has changed. One is that you have the two largest publishers in the direct market are owned by two of the largest corporations on planet Earth. And there was a time when Warner Brothers Corporate was not as deeply embedded in the publishing. And that was something that Paul Levitz, the president and publisher at the time, fought to maintain. Paul believed in the separation of corporate and publishing because he understood that when those two merged, the nature of how comic books would be developed and produced would change forever and never go back.
Right.
And so now what you see is you see ultimate and absolute synergy, right? When you're talking about Marvel Comics and their relationship to Marvel Studios, you see synergy. When you talk about DC Comics and their relationship to Warner Brothers Discovery, you see synergy. Now, synergy can be very exciting for the mass populace, but when you're dealing with comic books, it presents a whole new set of conditions, and sometimes those conditions change in a day, and creators have to adapt to it because there are corporate needs for what is to be done with Superman. There are corporate needs for what is to be done with Spider-Man. And so the kind of creative freedom that existed in the 70s or even the 80s, that does not exist now. This is an entirely different world in which the comic books are in service to larger corporate needs. And the higher up the food chain you go of intellectual property, the more so that is true. There is a difference between working on a Batman comic book and everything that entails and working on I don't even want to say Doom Patrol now because there is a Doom Patrol show, right? Sure. But I would say if you were working on a book called The Outsiders right now, that would involve less pressure. Same thing at Marvel. If you were working on something called The Defenders right now, since The Defenders Netflix show is already in the distant past as far as pop culture is concerned, that's a lot less stressful than if you were working on something called The Avengers, right? So that is one way, and the editors have to navigate this. And what that means is the editors are policemen on an entirely different level, or police persons, not to be gender biased, but also editors don't always get to choose their creative teams, because creative teams can be devised by upper management to achieve a certain level of sales in conjunction with a certain character. So you may be told, this writer and this artist, that's your team on this book. And it's like, okay, that's the job. Let me make the calls or send the emails, introduce myself, and then let's get the party started. So that's one difference. A second difference, when you're talking about the larger market, you have your stories on webtoons, when you're talking about manga, when you're talking about the digital distribution or the digital original formats, platforms, Tapas, Webtoon, as we said before, and you're talking about manga, now what you have is a need for editors to be fluent in English and Japanese, right? So if you're dealing with that sector of publishing and you're not bilingual in the way that is needed, you're a dinosaur. That's just the reality, right? So those are two ways in which things have changed as the markets become more profitable or as they become more magnified. Then the skill set and the requirements of the editors change. And part of what you have now is you have an industry with too few editors and too many books in relation to the number of editors. And that reduces the capacity for creativity and it increases the necessity for traffic management.
Right. Wow.
Yeah, I would say that one of the, in fact, I was talking to my friend Bill Ray the other day, and we were saying, you know, one of the biggest differences was that up until probably about the mid 90s for sure, because I left doing monthly comics in 96. But you know, you could go up to Marvel or DC and you could walk around, you could go in and walk around, you'd always pick up work. You'd see somebody at a show, or you see somebody in the office, hey, you know, would you be interested in doing it? Was like a real sort of, it was a smaller business, it was more casual. Every time I went into Marvel or DC, I got work, extra work, right? Same way you would go to a convention, you'd see somebody you knew at the convention. Hey, are you interested? Blah, blah. It's not that way now because you can't walk into the offices like you used to, right?
Number one.
You know, so, and then basically, in my case, all the people I work with, except for two people, Revort and Javens, are gone. All the editors I worked with from the mid 80s all the way through, they're not there. So you also don't have the history, because one of the things as a freelancer is the editors knew your history, right?
Right.
And they knew what you did and what you might be good at doing or what you wanted to do, right? Like, oh, I really like to try to draw this book. You know, I really like to do a Fantastic Four story, whatever. That it's not really laid out that way at all anymore. So you can't really walk into the offices, and it's not sort of loosey-goosey, you know, where you could just at Marvel, you would say like at 387, you could basically go in and walk down Editor's Row, and you would find some work if you were looking for extra work, especially in New York.
No doubt. And so what you're talking about is at the very least twofold, one of which is the generational shift. There's always a new generation of executives. And in one sense, that's editors, right? So an editor at Marvel before the Iron Man film came out is different from an editor at Marvel after Disney acquired Marvel.
Yeah.
An editor at DC Comics before the Arrowverse was born, before Zack Snyder did Man of Steel, before Christopher Nolan did The Dark Knight, is different than an editor after those benchmarks, because it changed the landscape. And it changed the landscape not only figuratively, but literally, because in the case of DC Comics had to move from New York to Burbank, right? So what you're talking about, the New York artists that could literally visit the offices of Marvel and DC in a day, You cannot do that anymore.
No.
And as these companies became, they used to be counterculture. Now they're mainstream culture. Now the stakes are higher. And so drawing these characters from a corporate standpoint is a privilege and a coveted opportunity. And so when they decide what creators are going to work on them, they're employing strategy. And sometimes that strategy is, what is that writer's record of sales? What is that artist's record of sales? If we can take that artist times that writer on that intellectual property, this is what the bean counters tell us we're going to get, right?
Moneyball.
So you're talking about equations.
Yeah.
You're literally talking about equations, and the editors have to maintain the validity of the equations, right? So there's a lot of pressure, and this is something that the fans do not understand.
Right.
They believe that running Batman is sexy. They believe that editing X-Men is fun. It is sexy and it is fun, but the sex and the fun are not the highest percentage quotients in this situation. It is high risk. You have a serious responsibility when you are responsible for intellectual properties that are movies, TV shows, video games, bed sheets, streaming shows, the whole ball of wax. So what you're talking about, Mike, that we are living in the future that Paul Levitz endeavored to hold back as long as possible. Because Paul Levitz started out as a creator, and so he understood intrinsically in what kind of environments innovation can flourish. And innovation can flourish in low-risk environments that invite crazy ideas, or high-risk environments that force innovation. And so that's where comic books is now. The comic book industry, and I'm just going to talk about the direct market. I'm not talking about the larger apparatus of Dogman and Raina Tagelmeyer and Big Nate.
Right.
The direct market comic book industry is a high risk, low finance, creative corporate apparatus that is both exciting and perilous and forces innovation.
Or they hope it forces innovation.
Well, I mean, listen, if it doesn't, the business dies, because the engine of the business is ideas. That's the engine of the business. The foundation of the business could be intellectual properties, it could be characters, but it's ideas, right? It's particular mindsets and what they inject into these characters. And creators are archaeologists. They dig and sweep away dirt, and they find something that hasn't quite been done before. And by doing that, they ignite characters, they ignite ideas, and by igniting ideas, they present Marvel Studios and Warner Brothers Discovery for opportunities to make new streaming shows, new movies, and so on and so forth. So innovation is a necessity. Without it, comics dies.
Joe, I don't want to go home. I don't ever want to go home. This is fantastic. We have a bunch of questions that are starting to load up. So, and I want to talk about Lion Forge, and I want to talk about heavy metal. I want to talk about Word. I want to talk about all this stuff. But we're running out of time.
All of it.
So, let's try this. I don't know why this echo is horrible. So my high school buddy Shannon Newby is now a small press publisher. Go read Newby Comics. Shannon
Yes.
says, could someone like Chris? Oh, this is horrible. Hold on, I'm gonna take my shit off.
Okay. Okay.
So Shannon says, could someone like Chris Claremont, who always pushed the envelope with story or killing characters permanently, exist? His approach made the X-Men iconic. What do you think about that show? And maybe even the role of a writer, kind of like navigating like story through editorial and making things stick. Is it the same today?
So that's a really big question. Let me try and answer it this way. Chris Claremont was given time by the industry to peak as a writer, right? The industry would give creators time to peak because it understood that investment in creators was investment in the future, right? So because Chris Claremont was given the time, and because at the time X-Men was not the prized gem of Marvel Publishing, X-Men was going to get canceled. The same way that when Frank Miller took over Daredevil, Daredevil was on the verge of cancellation. When Walt Simonson took over Thor, Thor was on the verge of cancellation. So creators who were given opportunities to grow were then attached to characters that were not high on the food chain. And so those were the environments in which they got to go for broke, right? If you're Frank Miller and Daredevil's about to get canceled, then I'm just going to do everything I want to do with Daredevil because he's got one foot in the grave anyway. And then Frank Miller and Klaus Janson and those creators changed Daredevil indelibly forever. So Chris Claremont, I don't know if the industry of today would give Chris Claremont the time to evolve and peak, right? And one thing that I can definitely tell you is that there is a publishing philosophy, and I'm not saying that any company is governed by this as a singular philosophy, but there is a philosophy that when you let a writer-artist team stay on a book for a long period of time, you take the risk of the consumers identifying the characters with that creative team. So when that creative team leaves, those characters are now in danger, especially if those creators then decide to go to Image Comics and make something else, and their audience migrates there away from the characters, right? So in that sense, I think it is rare, not non-existent, but it is relatively rare that a Claremont, Byrne, Austin, Glynis Wine, Tom Orzechowski team that dominated Uncanny X-Men for years would be allowed to have a long run now, right? So I think that's the answer. I think the dominant practice is for creators to have shorter runs on books, and then you move that creative team around your publishing universe.
Joe, I have a question for you, which has kind of been swirling around in all of the, I don't know what kind of cloud this lives in, but it seems like since the formation of Image, and this is pretty easy to track. And what you just said makes a lot of sense. It seemed like there was at the beginning of Image and like all of those guys leaving Marvel and forming this company, that was the last era of the artist having power versus now this is the writer's era, right? Where, you know, a lot of our guys are like, it's great that they put an interview or a preview of our book on whatever comic book site. Too bad that they left the artists out of it. You know what I
Right.
mean? Like this weird fight for equity inside comics where it's not so, you know, drawn in the sand that the artist is going to get the same billing as the writer.
Right.
I wonder how you feel about that, or is that off base? You know, or could you see that coming? Do you have any?
Well, it's definitely on target because, as you pointed out, Image was created by not a group of writers, right? Or else the company would probably have been called Narrative, but it was by a bunch of artists. And so they called the company Image.
Right.
And that spoke to the visual power of comic books. And the fact of the matter is, with the best writers, before you see the words, you see the art.
Mm-hmm.
The art is the first thing that draws you to comic books. So that speaks to the importance of the artist. I do think it is unfortunate that it seems like every year on schedule, you could time it. The social media debate about who is more important, the writer or the artist, comes up because that's a distraction from making the art. And art is not just visual. Art is everything, right? It's a team effort. Obviously, the person who illustrates the stories is wearing multiple hats if you were to parallel it to cinema roles, right? But the thing is, we should be working together to make the art and not let ourselves get caught up in these divisive conflicts. And to where the market does this, the market actually kind of goes back and forth, right? Sometimes it's the era of the writer, sometimes it's the era of the artist. Sometimes you will find a creative team that works so well together that this conversation is null and void, right? Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo when they reignited Batman, Tom King and Greg Smallwood on The Human Target, right? When you Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples on Saga, right? You have these teams that work so well together that the argument is irrelevant, right? But Image Comics definitely was a shift because what did it do? The artists were the true celebrities. And when I say celebrities, if you look at the Image documentary, they were like rock stars. That's not hyperbole. They had commercials for mainstream brands. They were on late night talk shows and they were multi-millionaires. They were celebrity moguls. And so, yes, that put the artist in a different category in the ecosystem, especially when in Image's first year, for 1 month, they were the #1 publisher. 1 month, they knocked Marvel out of the #1 spot in market share. So just an event like that was symbolic about the new world order.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that happened after the last big push at Marvel, where every month they introduced a new character like Darkhawk or whatever. You know, they were introducing all these new characters. Those guys are doing stuff. The sales are going up, and then when they tried to pitch Image to Marvel, Marvel's like, no. You know, we don't want to share any of this pie here. You know, and comics, the direct market, the main two, you know, nobody's going to create anything for them now like they were doing 30 years ago, because you'll lose control of it. You know, it's like if Mike Mignola had created Hellboy for Marvel, he wouldn't be still doing his character now.
Beyond a shadow of a doubt. And, you know, so another reason why these artistic shifts happen is because even at the mainstream companies, people who are artists achieve a certain level of power. When Joe Quesada became the editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics, there was this mass migration of artists from DC Comics to Marvel. And not only was there a migration, when they got to Marvel, their work got better. They were pulling off tricks that they never pulled off at DC Comics, because you had an artist as the editor-in-chief who knew how to talk to artists and encourage them to stretch new muscles and encourage them to be creatively innovative. To your point about creating characters that you have no ownership of, you know, for big companies, it wasn't as apparent until the movies, right? And when you saw the scale of influence, depending upon when you were born, you never thought you would live in a world where everyone knew the name Thanos. You never thought that that world was ever going to come to pass.
Groot?
And here we are in that world. And so creating Thanos, again, in a pre-Marvel Studios world is different from creating anything in a post-Marvel Studios world. And what I will say is that what we have come to learn is that when it comes to financial reward for characters that you create or co-create that are owned by corporations, we've learned that DC Comics provides larger payments than Marvel Comics. That is what journalism has revealed to us.
Yeah.
So if you decide that you want to play in a big sandbox in today's world, DC Comics makes more strategic and financial sense. Marvel Comics could make more visibility sense, but it's a trade-off, right? But it's, as you said, you know, if Mike Hellboy had said to any Marvel editor at the time, hey, you know, I have this great character. I'd like to introduce him in Doctor Strange. His name is Hellboy, right? That's an entirely different world. Not only is that a different world, that may not have been a better world for Hellboy, because Mike Mignola being able to maintain control of Hellboy meant that he was able to govern the purity of his vision across media. When a character is corporate, purity of vision is relatively different.
Oh yeah, I mean that was very clear in that at Marvel before I went to DC. I mean, like the Punisher was in every issue of every comic. Wolverine was in every issue of every comic, because those characters had some heat at the moment, right? And so we got to spread it. Oh, this book's sales are going down. Oh, guess what? The Punisher guest stars. And the other little secret that a lot of people didn't know is that at that time, in that version of Marvel, editors at the end of the year got a bonus based upon how well their books sold.
I heard that. That's very interesting. And of course, what does that do? So when you have that kind of financial incentive, that motivates you to be ruthless, right? It motivates you to be ruthless, not necessarily because you want to hold back somebody else. It could simply be as practical as, I have a wife and 2 kids, right? So of course I want that bonus, right? There can be a practical aspect to it. But honestly, when you set up a climate like that, you're talking about the Hunger Games.
Yeah. Well, there was a lot of that. There was a lot of inter-office politics and in competition.
No.
And there was a Wolverine project, as a matter of fact, that I had started on, and then the editor of that ended up having a disagreement with, I believe, Bob Harris, and then that was it. It was scrapped. So, things change stuff that you have no control over. Like the big gears are turning somewhere, and then you get a phone call.
It's true. I can tell you that, at the time when I worked in the Batman editorial office, Denny O'Neil was the group editor. Obviously, not only a legend, not only a brilliant writer and a brilliant editor, but a gentleman. And so the Batman editorial culture was really one of trust. And we were able to pick the creators that we wanted to come to the books, as long as those creators really brought value, right? And we're not talking about projecting a monetary value, but a quality value to the characters. And so I never worked at Marvel, so I was never part of the Hunger Games environment that you're talking about. And when I worked at DC, it was before DC moved to Burbank. So I had the benefit of working at a time when the company editorial really had a lot more freedom. The one thing that I remember us having to do, which I thought was a great system, was that once a year, every editor would have to have a meeting with Paul Levitz, and you would discuss what the next year of your book would look like. So I remember going to Paul's office, and he said, okay, let's talk about what the next year of Birds of Prey looks like. And we weren't talking about a sales perspective. We were talking about themes. What's the theme of your next year of Birds of Prey? How are you going to move the characters forward? How are you going to dramatically challenge the dynamics of their relationship and their self-awareness? We were talking about story and character evolution, and that was exciting. I don't know what the conversations are like now, because the stakes are higher and the conditions are different.
I want to do a time check with you, Joe. Do you want to start rapping, or do you want to go a little bit longer?
Nah, this is fun. Let's keep going.
All right. Well, we have a
big return after all.
Well, we do have a hard stop, and my dog's looking at me at the door. So I have a lightning round. I think we're going to get to. How's that?
Whatever the dog decides, I'm good with.
Yo, the poodle speaks. I think this might be time for lightning round. Question the time. So we're going to throw some questions at you, and if you want to give us some succinct answers, but feel free to what you want to make you like. David Peterson has been waiting very patiently since the beginning of
David.
And one of the things I love about this broadcast is that we always have superstars up in the chat, Joe. You never know who's going to drop by.
It's like awesome. It's awesome. David and I worked together back in the Archaea days. Love Mouse Guard.
Yeah. Hey, David, how are you? David asked Joe, how important is it for a comic to have commentary on the current world, opposed to a story for its own sake? Is it a mix? Do both need to exist? Great question, David.
I feel like comic books are entertainment first, and then I would say they're social commentary second. And the thing is, if you're writing in some response to the world in which you live, commentary is going to be intrinsic. Mm-hmm. When commentary supersedes story, when commentary supersedes character, that's when it is in danger of becoming the tip of the spear, right? The tip of the spear is the story, and the commentary should be intrinsic in that, right? And one of the things that I've encountered as an editor in comics and someone with my background and my history of advocacy for diversity and equality at all levels of this industry is that there's an expectation that, and this is not just myself, if we're going to be frank, there's an expectation that people of color have agendas, that they always come to the page with an agenda. And the thing is, we come to the characters, we come to the pages with the love of the characters. And so the world is what it is. Marvel Comics, what is the conceit of Marvel Comics? Underpinning conceit is the world outside your window. Stan said it. It holds true to this day. If we're going to write about the world outside our window, then some of that world is going to come into the story. But I don't believe that the story should be agenda first, right? Because when it's agenda first, what that's going to lead to is distortion of character to meet an agenda, distortion of story to meet an agenda. If you create realized characters and you put them in a world that is realized, the natural dynamics of our world are going to come out in the fiction, and then we can have conversations about that, right? The revamp of the entire X-Men franchise, which was spearheaded by Jonathan Hickman, intrinsic in that is a number of subjects to discuss. But are those subjects at the front? No. What is at the front is the place of mutants in society and the turning point that changed everything, right? Now, obviously, when you start sweeping away the layers like an archaeologist, what happens when the marginalized becomes the power? And how does the world respond to that, right? That's a conversation to have. But yeah, so to answer David's question, and Jamar asked for succinctly, and I apologize, that was not succinct. It's optional. It really depends on the creator, but I would always advise that the commentary is intrinsic in the story and not superseding the story.
That's great. That's absolutely great. Jamar had a canine related, he's on assignment for the moment.
I understand.
We've got another question coming in from Facebook from D. Brad Gibson. He says, I'm interested in what a story coach is. I think that's a title that not too many people are familiar with.
Right. So one of the things that I do is I'm a story coach for different creators. And so let me give you an example of some of the things that I talk about with a creator as a story coach. So when we have our first call, one of the first questions I'll usually ask, why this story? Tell me the origin of this story, because I want to know what its meaning is to them, so I can start getting inside their heads, so I can start employing empathy for why this is important to them. Then one of the next questions I'll ask is, what's the theme of your story? And when I ask that question, half the people either don't get it right because they don't know what a theme is, and that's okay, or people will honestly say, I don't know what it is. And then I'll say, okay, let's find it together. Because once you can identify the theme, you know that all of the characters in your story have to support or be in opposition to that theme. The theme is the fulcrum, right? Okay, so once we establish the theme, then we can talk about who are the characters in relation to this world, what is the character journey, what is the world journey, and in your mind, how are things different than they were at the beginning? And then let's start on the road there. And one of the things that we'll talk about is the difference between plot-driven stories and character-driven stories. We'll talk about what your goals are for your story. Is this 5 issues? Is this 5 years? And we do archaeology. So a story coach works with the creator at different stages to fully realize the story, because you never know totally what it is in the beginning. You're starting to put things together and it's going to reveal itself like a revelation. It's like therapy for those of us who have gone to therapy, right? A therapist will rarely tell you this is your problem. What they will do is they will show you correlations in behavior, and then you will see what the answer is, right? So a story coach leads you to the destination that cracks the story.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. I could tell when you were talking about the defending the Batman's decision and his the way he loathes firearms, that you were talking about it as from the perspective of Batman. And I'm wondering if that's part of your editing process is to and how that process, how you do that for a story, is see things from the perspective of the characters. And is there a process that you go through to do that? And how do you do that with something that doesn't have such a rich history as Batman? If it's a brand new project that's being brought to you, how do you find yourself in that headspace?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I ask questions. I keep asking questions, and then the person I'm working with, then the answers will start coming. And so, okay, so here's a hypothetical question, right? If you tell me something like, this person hates chocolate, just something that sounds trivial, right? Why? Well, I don't know why, right? So if hypothetically you were to say something like, that person's abusive parent made them gorge themselves on chocolate one day until they vomited and traumatized them. Then 30 years later, if that person's a detective, anyone offers them a Snickers, nah, I'm good. Right? Now you think that's a small thing, but that's a texture in a character that traces back to parental abuse.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I remember reading a book, I think it was called Sid Field Storytelling. And he talked about the film Chinatown, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he talked about Jack Nicholson's character is vain. That's why he had someone break his nose, so he would have to wear a bandage over his nose for the rest of the film, because he was so involved in how handsome he was that he needed to be challenged. That needed to be removed so that we could see, and that he could see, that his potency did not come from his looks. His potency came from his abilities, right? So character texture connects to events and connects to trauma or pleasure, if you are so fortunate.
Wow.
What I missed?
like the rest of the world, you'll be rewatching this episode again and again and again, because this is fantastic. This is fantastic.
Okay, there's another. I'm a little frazzled. There's another question. A good friend, Christopher Sotomayor. Good to see you. Another celebrity in the chat has a question for you, Joe.
Okay.
A broad question about the future of comics and publishing. How do you attract new readers to an American market that currently caters to an aging and fading clientele, or caters to an aging and fading? Oh, yeah, who said the same thing twice?
It's an excellent question. I've been thinking about it a bit, because this also relates to my work as a story coach. So one of the questions that a number of people ask me because of my history in comics, they would say, Joe, when you do something creator-owned, will it be a superhero universe? And I say, God, no. There's no way in God's green earth I'm going to create a superhero universe, because right there I set myself up to be put in a conversation that will involve Marvel and DC and will diminish my creations, right? So what I was saying to you earlier, Mike, about that the conditions of the comic book industry force us to be innovative. We need an injection of new ideas. Desperately, desperately, desperately. On the independent sector, the comic books that are sticking out are the ones that are not like every other thing, right? Whether it's the many deaths of Layla Starr at Boom, whether it's something is killing the children, even The Walking Dead. The Walking Dead was the zombie film that never ended, which was not about the zombies, right? It was about the people. We need new ideas. And the thing about new ideas is we are taught that new ideas will not be the gateway to financial prosperity, because the comic book industry is not an industry in which most of its participants are fortunate enough to know financial prosperity. And so we're taught, we're socialized to adopt the familiar. We're not socialized to just go bat crazy and come up with something that either the industry hasn't seen or it hasn't seen it the way you will tell it, or I will tell it, or Mike or Steve will tell it. So we need to be innovative. And here's the thing about really good ideas. Really good ideas break demographics, right? It's not, this is a cool idea for an 8-year-old. This is a cool idea for a 30-year-old. What if this is freaking cool and a number of people can subscribe? I remember shortly after 9/11, and I was born and raised in New York, and I was living in New York at the time. And I remember writing the trains. And I remember I saw this girl reading Saga. And she must have been 16 years old, right? I don't know if she'd ever read a superhero comic, but she was reading Saga. And something like that. I remember after HBO's Watchmen came out, I saw this young lady on a train and she was reading the Watchmen trade paperback, right? Because something about the Watchmen television show illuminated this world so much for her that she wanted to explore its origin, right? Now, a number of people would tell you Watchmen is a superhero comic for superhero fans. A number of people would categorize, we talked about Mouse Guard when David showed up. I loved Mouse Guard, but the reason I first bought Mouse Guard was for my goddaughter, who at the time was 8 years old. And the big joke of it is, when I bought my first Mouse Guard, I bought it for her, but I read her copy on the way to give it to her, and I made sure, not to leave any fingerprints or nothing like that. And I gave it to her as a gift. Listen, it was in good condition, right? And I was like, man, I really like that comic. I want to get one of my own. And I went back the next day, there were none. Right? That's what we need in comics.
Yeah,
we need ideas that are so freaking cool that they break demographic barriers.
Well, it's funny that you say that, because I've been having this conversation on my Facebook page the last couple of days about this.
Yes, I saw your long form post.
Right. And I think that's what manga does, that
100%
market no longer does, because you've got all these kids I've been teaching for 20 years, and over the course of 20 years, it's more and more people reading that material and less of those same, the same teenager that I was when I was, 12, 11, 13, and, you really get it more serious into reading comics. You also have way more girls and women reading comics now than ever, and making. And the direct market, for the most part, has always kind of ignored that girl comics, and the way that the women very often are depicted is in a way that would appeal to the post-pulp male audience, which I am one. But I know from having 2 young female assistants, when they would look at that stuff, they would be like, "What's with this tit window? That looks kind of stupid." It's like to them, to us, it's like, "Oh, that's sexy." To them, they're looking at it like, I wouldn't, if I'm going into battle, I would not look like Red Sonja. You know what I mean?
Right. Right.
And also the world building is they love Miyazaki, they love manga because it's a completely different, fresh take on the worlds. And like I just said a little while ago in my post, it's also cute and attractive, and that's a big difference too, because Jack Kirby's attractive to me.
Right.
I doubt whether Jack Kirby is attractive to a 17-year-old female reader. There are some, but I think you would grow into that.
What happens is when you look at artists graduating from art colleges, or artists that don't have a formal art training but work on their craft and become really talented, what are their influences? If your influence is anime, then the kinds of stories that you're going to create are going to speak to that influence. Stories come from personal trauma. Personal trauma is something that in the 20th century we were told, don't talk about that. No one wants to hear about that. I don't want to deal with your weaknesses. Like, keep that in a box. But now, I mean, people are so traumatized that we need to put it out in the artwork. So again, we're forced to be innovative. And part of being innovative is soliciting opinions from people that understand what is innovative in comics today, what is innovative in art today. It's like, as a creator, you constantly have to be absorbing. And Mike, this goes back to something that you spoke about, which was how, as an artist, your career could be subject to generational shifts in editorial staffing. One of the great challenges is staying relevant. And what's unfortunate is that staying skilled doesn't automatically mean staying relevant. You have to be able to somehow transform what you do into something that fits into the ecosystem of now. And maybe it fits in different ecosystems. I mean, artists are fortunate in a sense because based on your skills, you could enter different industries. I mean, I remember when I was on Batman, there were people that left comics for movies. There was a really gifted artist, Rodolfo DiMaggio. He was a Batman guy. He left for doing storyboards and never looked back.
Yeah. Well, I left in '96. I saw the writing on the wall and went into animation. I've come back, but I'm not back in the way that I was before I tried self-publishing. And I'm very aware, I think probably also through teaching and seeing how the world is changing, how people are coming in. And even the students that I taught 20 years ago are very different than if I was going to go down and teach a class of 15-year-olds today.
No doubt. Undoubtedly.
You know? And so there's sort of a cadre of guys around my age who are a little bit bitter about things, who don't want to change, who just kind of think like, well, if we can make comics like 1974, and I love comics from 1974, but you're not going to get a 15-year-old to read comics from 1974, not in any kind of real number now.
Yeah, and part of what's always sobering for me is that there were people that were thinking that when I entered comics. I know there were people when I was editing Batman probably thinking, what's this kid doing here? I should be doing that. That probably wanted to chop both my arms off so they could have my job because they felt that their perspective was more purist, right? But it's all generational, especially art, right? And so it's navigating within that and finding our new place. What's our new place in the structure of things, right? And so that's part of the adventure, and it's also part of the fun. And to Shelley's point, yes, I discovered heavy metal when I was 13 years old as a student of High School of Art and Design in Manhattan, and it forever changed my perception of what was possible in comics.
Me too. I mean, seeing that first couple issues and finding a Mobius, it was just like, that was it.
That's it.
Well, Joe, I can't let you out of here without you talking. It's almost like from an A to Z, and then you're already on to something new. You got to tell us about heavy metal. Then we got to have you back on.
Okay, cool. What would you like to know? Or do I just go off the cuff and talk about heavy metal?
Yeah, just talk about heavy metal because I know that you just stepped down from a pretty lofty position over at heavy metal. And I know like we started at Milestone and jumped way ahead to heavy metal, and there's so much in the middle. Like we have to have you come back. But to Shelley's point, and just how seminal heavy metal is to the culture. Maybe talk about how you got involved with heavy metal.
Sure. So I discovered it at the age of 13, and that's when I first saw the European artists, right? And I remained, of course, you have to remain aware of heavy metal through the years. But when you look at heavy metal as the pebble in the pond, and then you understand, well, that's where you got Epic Illustrated. That's where you got the Epic division at Marvel. That is what laid the road for Vertigo at DC, which will always be one of the most important imprints in North American comics. When you look at all the different publishers that are out now, whether it's a Dark Horse, whether it's a Vault Comics, these companies were able to go against the culture of superheroes because heavy metal was an example in the North American space, right? So when I had the opportunity to work at heavy metal, the first thing that I wanted to do, well, there were two things. Number one, heavy metal is a publication that's gone through its ups and downs, and there are a number of great people who have carried it through, but heavy metal had become unremarkable. And I say that to say that its conceit at the top of the magazine, right? The world's greatest illustrated magazine. It stopped being that. So one of my first missions was to bring amazing artists to heavy metal, like open the doors wide and say, come do things because we need to elevate the art at heavy metal once again. So that was one. And by doing that, bringing in my old bud Butch Geis from Birds of Prey, who's just like truly an amazing illustrator, getting to work with Patrick Zerker, newer talents like Al Barrio Nuevo, Christian Rosado. And the second priority was Tarna. So Tarna was introduced in the heavy metal animated film in 1981. And when a lot of people think about heavy metal, they still think about that film, and they think about that iconic poster of her riding the creature that came from Mobius's Arzak. The poster was illustrated by Chris Achilleos, whom we lost a few years ago, tragically. So I understood that Tarna was the tip of heavy metal's spear, the same way Batman is the tip of DC's comics publishing spear. But Tarna was a character heavy metal barely used. She had been around for decades, and heavy metal kept her in a box. So I wanted to bring her out of that box. So I worked closely with the CEO and the publisher, who is also the chief creative officer, and we relaunched Tarna and we put her in the front, right? Because when companies are at their most focused, you can ask someone, when you think of that company, what's the first character you think of? And they can tell you, right? There are some companies now, you absolutely can't do that. 4 different people have 4 different answers, right? So for heavy metal, it was important that we elevated Tarna back to her iconic status. And it was important that we invite just like amazing artists to do amazing things. Tim Seeley, who was working with me at heavy metal when I first got there, he had a rule, and I agree with it 100%. If you drop an issue of heavy metal, whatever pages it landed on, there should be amazing artwork. That's it. It's the world's greatest illustrated magazine. And if it's not, then that conceit is a lie. Right? And we had to make sure that conceit was the truth. So it was a really amazing 3-year run. And the reality is, and this is something that we're going to be dealing with a lot this year, we are dealing with a reckoning of the number of publishers versus the financial resources for all those publishers to be self-sustaining. Because the philosophy of publishing for Hollywood is very perilous. And when you see a company like Netflix do an entire season of Grendel, shot an entire season of Grendel, and then it doesn't come out, is that really the goal? Is that really the end of the line? Or is it possible that publishing can be self-sustaining? And if publishing can't be self-sustaining, your time here is limited. There are only so many investors. There are only so many angels, right? And so heavy metal reached a point where it could no longer financially sustain itself. And so it ended all the contracts with its independent contractors, right? And it did that at the end of last year, which is, unfortunately was a terrible time. And, you know, what was important to me as a team member was, you know, when you leave a room or whenever you walk away, like walk away with consideration. So the last thing that, you know, we put to bed was the new heavy metal #1. What the future is, I have no idea, but you know, that's what we owed to the fans. That's what as a team we owed to each other. And so it was 3 years. It was amazing. You never could have told that kid at High School of Art and Design that he would be the executive editor of Heavy Metal Magazine, but we did re-elevate that magazine. We made the brand mean something, and there were creators that it was their dream to be published in heavy metal. We did that. I mean, at the core of comics, we're supposed to be making dreams come true. That's it, right? Because a lot of us aren't getting rich here. So we should be having fun. We should be elevating one another, and we should be making cool stuff.
Yeah,
Joe,
I would say that no one I know ever thought about doing comics to get rich. You thought, you know, you could be successful and you could make a living, but no one would think like, yes, this is going to be the thing that makes me rich. Now, maybe in the 50s, you could have said that if you wanted to be a comic strip artist, but not in comic books. I don't think it was the kind of thing that I always thought that successful and make a living if my work was good, and then people would want to work with you. But it wasn't like I was thinking, oh, I'm going to be a millionaire.
Right.
Yeah.
That's true.
Joe, our good friend Tony DePaul, writer of The Phantom, works with Mike.
Oh my goodness!
I told you.
Kind thing to say.
This is like a cavalcade of stars up in
He's
here.
the writer of The Phantom?
Yes.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, thank you so much for your kind words. I'm a big fan of Lee Falk's great creation, and I was even a fan of a little known gem, which was an animated series called Phantom 2030, I think, or 2040, and it was spearheaded by the illustrator of Aeon Flux.
Oh, right.
Peter Chung.
Peter Chung.
So I'm a big fan of The Phantom, and thank you so much for what you're doing, Tony, and keeping him alive.
That's right. Tony says, I'd watch 6 hours of this episode, guys, and I concur. We're gonna put a pin in this, Joe. But I have to do this. I haven't done this in a while. This episode was Chef's Kiss.
Well, thank you so much. It's really been great, like being here and talking with y'all. I love it.
Thanks, man. And you know, one thing that I said to you, and also most of the guests say at the end of these things, is I don't know where the time went. I felt like we just got started. So, and I apologize for just kind of leapfrogging over the majority of your career. But Joe, you got to come back. Can you come back again? Can we make
Definitely.
that work?
We'll have to make it happen.
All right. We're going to do that before this year is over. Joe Illidge, where can people follow you on the internets?
Sure. So on Facebook, I'm Joe Illidge. At Twitter, I'm Joseph P. Illidge, as per the Chiron below. On Instagram, I'm illmaster1 because I had to shake it up a bit. My website is josephillidge.com. So if people are interested in working with a story coach and someone that wants to help them take their ideas to the next level, navigate within the comic book industry, and help you be the archaeologist and find your story and make it the best that it can be, find me there and you'll get a sense of where I've been and what I do.
I love it. Thank you so much, Joe. And you guys, thank you guys for watching tonight. Please don't keep this to yourselves. Don't hoard Pencil to Pencil. Share it. Give abundance and pass this around to all of your friends, because we're growing very slowly. We're almost at 1,000 subs. I think we can cross that threshold very soon. What do you say? Thank you guys so much. I'm really happy to be back. In other Pencil to Pencil news, coffee break with JN tomorrow night at 9 p.m. Be there with your coffee mug on this channel. I'm so excited that Steve and Mike held it down over the last couple of weeks. Thank you guys so much. I love you guys. I can't do this without you. Joe, we do a thing here before we go home, and you're going to do it.
All right. Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are still in a pandemic. So I implore you to, come on, Joe, wash those Kirby hands. Let's see those Kirby hands, bro. Put them up.
All right.
Oh, there you go. That's a good one.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah, listen, 3D, they're coming at you like Black Bolt.
Like
Black coming at you, man.
I love it. Thank you guys so much. We'll see you next week.
See you, everybody.
Bye. Go to bed.